Las manos sirven para estrangular, escribir un poema, poner bombas, matar a otro, salvar a un inocente. Las manos sirven para todo menos para pensar. Con las manos puedes pescar un pez, atrapar un pájaro, tocar un cuerpo, pedir silencio, palparte tú. Las manos sirven para todo, menos para soñar.
Kepa Murua is one of the great poets in the Spanish language of the last decades. Since that distant and perhaps premonitory Spartan in Honours, published in 1990, up to his most recent release, the monumental single poetry, Pure Premonition, from 2010, the Guipuzcoan poet has published nearly 20 books, practically all during the last decade. Throughout this fructiferous period, his writing on the edge and without concessions, Kepa Murua's radical commitment to modernity has given us titles such as I Always Counted to 10 and You Never Appeared, Digging the Earth with Your Dreams, A Place for Us, Cardio Slogans, and Poetry in You. A more tender and reflexive writing, but no less modern, arrived in 2008 with its Nothing, which displayed the constant searching and absolute freedom of this author, whom some branded as unclassifiable. We mustn't forget, in this short presentation, his applauded foray into essay, with his excellent works in collaboration with photographers, musicians and painters. Kepa Murua was born in 1962 and has lived for many years in Vitoria. Kepa, hello.
How are you?
Very well. The first thing I'd like to ask you before we start with the fervent present of 2010 is that we go back in time, even to before 1990, with the Spartan in Honours. This is a far-reaching exercise, so that you can tell us how you start writing, in which context, if you even remember that first poem, which every poet usually remembers.
I recall myself reading. I remember that at home, my father had a very varied but very interesting library, with books from Salvat, that collection of Nobel Prize winners, with authors such as Mikhail Sholokhov. It also had the complete works of Shakespeare. I remember reading. To writing, I think I took very naturally, without thinking too much about it. But I think that first I was a great reader, and I still am.
When you start writing, is the first text poetic, let's say with verse or running prose?
Yes, you asked me before. I remember a complete poem. I would be about 15 or 16 years old, and I remember the title was Ni farò la banint, If I Were a Street Lamp. That's when I realised that I'd done something different. It was a very complete poem, extensive, also quite narrative, where I put myself inside the figure, inside a street lamp which lit up a seascape. I also remember that poem caught my attention because at that time I had some doubts about which language to choose. That poem, written in Basque, could mark a direction in my writing. But the truth is, I read in Spanish, and my poetic language was also maturing in Spanish.
If you were a street lamp would be the translation.
Yes, that would be the translation, if I were a street lamp.
You were looking out to sea, which is one of the themes, one of the clear landscapes of yours.
Yes, I was born in a coastal village, many hours of solitude and also of amusement, of having fun with friends. The sea was a view which relaxed me. Not only bathing, I really enjoy swimming, but the walks through the sea, along the beach in solitary moments in the rain, with the grey sky, were for me most definitely moments of spiritual retreat. And even being an adolescent and young, it allowed me to discover myself. It made me a restless kid inside. I would ask myself lots of questions, and both reading and writing helped me to find my place in the world. At first it was pure babble. Then it became a way of understanding the world and also a profession.
And in those first readings, you've quoted Sholojov, but I know that you like, for example, Rilke. What influence has he had on you?
I also remember that outside my father's library, I bought 2 books. One was Letter to His Father by Franz Kafka, and the other was Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. The reading of those 2 books meant a change in my way of understanding the world, and also art. Because there I became conscious that they were different texts, something which I couldn't explain then, but later I understood what literature was. It was art. It was an art which kept me company during reflection, not only in imagination. It was an important journey. I think those 2 writers, Kafka and especially Rilke, took me into that poetry wavelength.
When you were reading that work by Rilke, who were you? The writer who was writing to the young man, or the young man who received the letters from the veteran writer?
I was the reader. I was the reader. Later on in time, as a result of receiving letters from young writers, I wrote an essay taking as the basis, or the foundation, that book, Letters to a Young Poet, and I converted it into poetry, that's if it exists. But it is true that at that moment I was unable to rationalise to such an extent. It was more of an intuitive reading, but those emotional changes gradually became a personal poetics, because I always liked knowing why I was writing, why I was reading, where I was.
There's a refrain in that book, Poetry, That's If It Exists, which was in order to write poetry. Many of the entries in that book begin with that leitmotif. What is needed to write poetry?
To write poetry, you have to have a different vision, an awareness of time, and a radical commitment to that kind of writing, because it's a writing which takes you into reflection, to solitude, inevitably internal journey. I don't recommend it to everyone, because to write poetry, you have to be very, very strong.
And within that strength, I suppose you have to have a method, a system, a formula. Not a writing formula, but a formula like those craftsmen who keep their workshop perfectly tidy. What are the forms which Kepa uses? How does he manage his notebooks? Does he use notebooks or a computer? How does he organise himself in all that disorder? Because you've written almost 20 books, some of them very thick.
And all those books, although all by Kepa Murua, where you can recognise the voice of one author, are different, with different nuances. The books are different. I work on the concept of a book of poems, but the books can be short or they can be more extensive. Short books call up emotions and immediate feeling, and longer books summon time, maturity. You could say that in longer books there is a much more rational literary apparatus, better thought out. But it doesn't have to be like that. Sometimes in long books too, there's an important backroom literary. Although they are different, I still write by hand in some notebooks, and am inevitably accompanied by a computer. But the time and the writing have to be the same. They have to submit, generally, to the rhythm of awareness. Just because you write on a computer or in pencil doesn't mean that you have to do it at a set pace, faster or slower. It must be a rhythm of mental awareness, of writing, and that can be supported by any medium. All you need is a pencil, a pen and a blank page, or it could be the blank screen of a computer. But in principle, to write poetry in this field, you have to look for an idea, you have to look for an approach, you have to look for sequences. We could transfer it to the field of music and talk as if it was a symphony, and if we went over to the field of cinema, we could say that it's a film, with its sequences, its shots, its rhythms.
It's discarded material, I suppose.
That's right, yes, a lot of discarded material. What isn't said when a book is published or read. Generally, the author doesn't talk about that discarded material, but one of the most important things in writing is the rewriting, the correction. One doesn't finish it just because. You finish it after rewriting it several times, when you've corrected it very well, and when finally all the pieces fit together.
And to write poetry, later we'll talk about collaborators and other things, there's a word which comes up a lot, above all in your books of essays, which is silence. Does Kepa Murua write in silence? Does he write listening to music, to birds outside the window?
Well, there's a bit of everything. There are many books which have been written in silence, but there are also others which are accompanied by a certain noise. Music can be a pleasant companion. It could be classical music, rock and roll, late-night jazz, a bit of everything. You have to find pleasant moments, and each book has music. I could talk about, for example, books like Hands Up, which are linked to a kind of music such as rock and roll. But there are others which have a much more religious music, or more intimate or mystic. It's inevitable. They're the moments which one listens to in the time of his own existence.
And speaking of music, we've talked about the music you listen to when you write. There's a part of your work, everyone knows the trilogy, China, Fleisch and Faber, but also poems of the Walker and all the illustrations which Mincho did. Apart from in that book, in the first works published by Kalamur, why are you open to collaboration with other artists, photographers, painters and musicians?
Precisely to complete that silence, also to escape from that silence, which is very good for creation, and also to learn, to leave the isolation. Working with other artists means that you learn. You discover that you're not who you thought you were, and you learn just how others see you. You also learn from their gestures, their intuitions, their artistic knowledge, and their artistic language is different from yours. Then, in that mutual understanding, you two start adjusting your voice. You start listening to its opinions, and inevitably a communication develops. That communication is recommendable for all artists, especially for writers, and even more so for poets, because they leave their isolation and they give themselves over to the world with other hands, with sensitivity, and that learning is inevitable. One later, after learning or collaborating with musicians, painters, photographers, goes back to his solitude, but unavoidably he steps into the world through those languages.
Before, you said that as much as if one writes in pencil or by computer, it's the speed of awareness that marks the rhythm, and that tells us that in the end the format counts. That is, the frame conditions the work.
Yes, and the language sometimes, yes.
And for example, what did you feel when you heard your poems sang by Tasio Miranda?
For me, it was very important, because I could come from having matured the ideas, like the relationship between short poem and long poem, and also the play between poetry and song. I felt satisfaction on the one hand and generosity, because singer-songwriters condense the poem. They want to cut it down. They want to underline a sort of chorus that they appear to see in the poem. But I also saw that that husky voice, that sound, fitted perfectly with the kind of poem chosen, and it gave it spaciousness. In fact, when a singer-songwriter notices a poet, those poems are amplified, extended to a certain number of readers or spectators, and it's a very interesting way of spreading poetry further than published books or writings.
Indeed, poetry and music, right back to the Greeks, were very united, and later the paths of culture have separated them.
Yeah, let's say that genres many times were invented by man to create a vision which is more didactic than real.
And then there's another great relationship. We've talked about the relationship that Kepa has with other artists and the relationship he has with writing, how it's born. But then there's the relationship with the reader. You're a poet and a writer who isn't only shut inside his house but attends recitals, book fairs, signs copies. What's the good? What's the bad? What do you learn? Because in the end it's very important. What do you learn from the relationship with the reader?
You learn a lot, more than people think. Inevitably the relationship with the reader leads you to positions of humility which are wonderful. The reader, although he's not always right in what he says, is one of the best companions of the solitary writer, for the poet, because he says things, he tells him things, and also gives his opinion. It's not only through this relationship in book fairs, presentations, but with letters that you receive. One sees there a kind of very personal critique, very direct, where a spade is a spade, without great metaphors which can confuse you. And it's then that one sees the vision which transcends. And above all, the interpretation which people make of your own writings.
Which must be amazing.
Yes, it's surprising, it's magical. I've already said that they're not always right, but they also help you to understand what you unavoidably. Those letters very often encourage you to go on writing.
That you was present in the first books of the year 2000 of I Always Counted to 10 and You Never Appeared, or A Place for Us. The us comes after. Are you alluding to that reader with that you never appeared?
Yes, at the beginning, yes. I respect the reader on all levels, even when he's wrong. But later, that you transcends. Inevitably, it's a dialogue I have with the reader, but later that dialogue transcends to the loved one in the case of love poems, or maybe also to friends. And inevitably, in the end, that you becomes confused with the I. I mean that one talks to oneself. But that dialogue between the poet's voice and the reader, or that person who can appear as a valid conversational partner, for me is very important. In fact, although my registers are very lyrical in some books, in It's Nothing, that dialogue, which is also shown in a formal distinction, where certain voices appear in italics, is very, very important, because I'm looking for a complicity and also a group echo, so that we can go together along that journey, which is literature, or in this case poetry, which gets mixed up with life.
You said before that you were born in a coastal village, which between the dilemma of one or other language, like what happened to so many other, above all Central European writers in the 20th century, you choose one. And that inevitably places you in a kind of double periphery, geographical and also linguistic. How do you live with that sensation of periphery?
Well, the language chooses you. It's a strange feeling. When you're young, it's a strange feeling until you start to define your own ways, your world, and also your spheres of behaviour. But the periphery has two things. One, inevitably, is the freedom which writing without any kind of pressure gives you. You seem forgotten. You're like a leper for the critics. You're like an outsider for everyone until your books start to sound familiar and start appearing out there intermittently. But on the other hand, there's a powerful isolation. That's why I said at the start that to write, to be a poet in the 21st century, you have to prepare yourself to be really strong, to be able to respond to that solitude which writing leads you to live, because the periphery and solitude on the periphery involves a marginalisation of power circles, a disappearance from anthologies, let's say, a not being inside literary society, which in Spain is precisely really important in order to survive. The grants, the awards, the trips. Well, one realises after 20 years that his solitude is almost his very strength. There comes a point when he no longer pays so much attention to that literary society.
And you're still, I suppose, like that street lamp from the first boat.
Yes, you feel isolated. You have your fellow travellers who in turn feel isolated, being in the centre of a big city or living on the periphery, because in the end it's just you and the writing. Then the focus is, what concept do you have of writing? How do you approach your own life and in the end what you write?
Couldn't it be said, from what you're saying, that one of the strong, potent transversal themes of many or quite a lot of your books is the dilemma between communication and lack of communication, between defeat and victory among human beings, not of wars and no wars, but rather getting to people's hearts?
Yes, it's the antagonism between the light and the shadows, but it's true, communication and lack of communication. Lately in my books I realise that I'm talking about the communication or the lack of communication between lovers, of love, of desire. That's a main theme. Also when I've used more social or political registers, or when I've opted for a much more narrative poetry or writing, also in my essays, I think that that's what I'm talking about. about the lack of communication between society and the writer, and also how the writer often tries to communicate with society without getting a response.
And in all this process of communication and lack of communication, you create a subgenre within poetry, which appears in A Place for Us, if I remember rightly, and after then reappears in other books, which is the self-portrait. I remember a poem titled Self-Portrait with Guns. What a title! Why does that need to arise to portray yourself with words? Because the prevalent thing up to then was to do it with colours and with shapes in painting.
To explain myself. To explain to myself who I am, and inevitably to tell myself what I'm like with the passing of time. It started in A Place for Us almost intuitively. I did some portraits of poets, and so that it wasn't too obvious which poets I was talking about, I placed as a contraposition or as balance, I put a set of shattering self-portraits with guns, etc. Later in the following books I carried on the process because I really like art. In fact, I sometimes think I'm more interested in art than in literature itself. In the self-portraits of the great painters, the painters I love, like Kirchner, Munch, Nussbaum, Titian himself, got me thinking that if they could paint themselves, then I could do it with words. I've got quite a few self-portraits, but not out of narcissism or exhibitionism, but to prop up my own voice, to reaffirm whereabouts I am in that time and how I see myself, and inevitably to discover certain features of my body, which I also think is important.
But you never carried a gun?
No, I'm a very peaceful man. And above all my poetry, although sometimes it can seem very radical, as you've said, there's always a light which summons hope, reconciliation, the thought that the best is yet to come.
You talked about art. Your academic training also includes that, art. Between life, art and literature, which one do you choose?
Life. In fact, life is art par excellence.
And of all the arts that you know, the classical disciplines which there are, which is the one which most draws your attention? For example, between architecture, for example, and dance, or between music and, let's say, painting. What are your weaknesses? You must have some.
Yes, I like painting. I'm an active museum goer. I often visit art galleries and lose myself among labyrinths in order to look at paintings. I like music, but I don't reject any art. I like dance. I think a person should be open to all kinds of life experiences, human and of course artistic. In art generally, man is portrayed and he transcends society itself.
You said that you choose life, and there's part of your work in which there's a part of people's lives which is very important, which is space, and that in art is usually called landscape. There's a trilogy which we mentioned before, Ichina, Fleisch and Faber, which just talks about that, landscape. How important is it for you?
The landscape is important. One has to know where he lives, and the landscape positions us with certain humility as human beings, as people. The landscape in my poetry has a vision Zen. It transcends reality itself. In the case of the trilogy Ichina, Fleisch and Faber, I blended a lyrical vision, a poetic prose along the lines of José María Álvarez's photographs, and in the end I realised that I was talking about the solidity of the landscape against the fragility of the human being. They're poems with a very deep philosophical weight, very tender, and I think that they're poems still to be discovered, because people reject, I don't know why, poetic prose. But the simplicity of those poems, the existential achievement, and above all the voice, the lyrical voice, I think haven't yet been discovered, precisely because there's a complex labour which the reader will never see. That's a way of squeezing out the landscape as much as possible, and also showing that landscapes can also be made with literature.
It was moreover in that trilogy, I loved the first two volumes, and I was even lucky enough to write the introduction to one of them. But the third was the one which most surprised me, because suddenly the natural landscape no longer had the leading role, and this was taken over by the hand of man, the Latin faber, things broken, demolished, broken bridges, those walls which had fallen down.
The passage of time, the ruins, the defeats, all the important elements of my literature. Also in the form there's a structural change. In the first two books, both in Ichina and Flish, I came after the photographer. The photographer did the first spread and then I placed the text and the empty spaces. But to close the trilogy, I asked José María Álvarez to let me mark the rhythm, to let me start and finish it, and also to let me choose the visual itinerary of those poems. That's why Faber contains a more accurate component, let's say, from the point of view of literary development. It opens and closes definitely. And there is a journey of man, a journey of the human being through death, life, love, hope, light, and above all, that playing with the landscape that Ichina and Flish have, but in a more diluted way.
It's an extremely beautiful book. It has gorgeous photographs of all this that we're talking about, of things which finish but which at the same time announce that something can continue. Let's leave the genre of poetry, let's leave the collaborations, and let's concentrate on those two books, which, like a hinge, let's say, between the first period of poetry, which was very, very innovative and very, very avant-garde poetry, now removed of its historiography component, arrive with the essays. The two essays which were already anticipated in Poetry and You, but which have the power in poetry, that's if it exists, and after in Essay About Art. Why does Kepa Murua at one point say, well, now I have to stop? Not stop because we know one never stops writing. Another thing is the pace of publication. But why does he say, now I have to tell my readers what I think about art, or firstly what I think about poetry, and then what I think about art?
To place myself within some sort of context. I'm an anomalous poet, or I was, because before, more or less young poets didn't develop a poetics of their own. And I was anomalous because while writing I would explain things to myself with aphorism, like with Poetry New, or with Poetry That's If It Exists, when I was trying to give young poets not lessons, but rather a set of guidance from a very personal viewpoint. I try to explain to myself what the world is like. I try to explain to myself why I write, and from there springs all my poetics, all my essay. They're essays with an interesting philosophical current, and above all with a lyrical voice to consider. Essays within the literary field is because I live inside of writing, and once you live inside of writing you have to know, as I said before, not only where you live but also why and how you write. However, in Essay Within the Art World I didn't realise that the concept of art also included writing itself. When I talk about the creator and the artist, I'm talking about the musician, but I'm also talking about the poet, and in the end it's the vision which one has through art, museums, art galleries, painting, and the artistic spectator relationship, etc., which is almost like the poet-reader relationship, and in the end I'm talking about things which interest me, in order to transcend from a literary viewpoint that which is the human reality.
With provocative opinions in the case of Essay About Art, and which sometimes poke in the eye, both contemporary art and certain artistic institutions, which, without naming names of course, many times confuse one thing with another.
They're in-your-face essays, but that doesn't mean that they lack respect or good manners or tact. In fact, they're essays in which one adapts to the right word, to expressions and beautiful turns of phrase. But inevitably I have a somewhat critical view of institutions, of what many times seems valid in the art world and also literature. And that's why I like to voice my opinion about it.
And from all that reflection about poetry and art, how does the 21st century open itself up to poetry? What poetry can this century give us? A century of which we've already lived 11 years, let's not forget.
I think that at this time, the poetry which will be discovered later in the 21st century is a poetry which hasn't yet been done. It's probably being written by some young, restless kid, most likely unaware, in some lost city, mingling with other cultural entities, with musicians, using new technology, internet. Because very often, quality poetry, or the poetry I'm interested in personally as a reader and as a researcher, is that which isn't in the media, that which isn't recognised by the institutions. And this is inevitable.
The periphery.
Yes, I think that in the radicalism of the periphery in a specific country, a voice will appear which will be the portrait of this chaos of the beginning of the 21st century, and which later with time will become like a metaphor of a part of that 21st century.
And right now, what are you working on? I mean, we said that there have been 20 years of writing, and there are 20 net years of writing every day. I know you sit in front of the computer or paper, you take your pen or switch on the computer, and right now, is there a release in the offing? Are you involved in some other adventure?
Yes, I'm involved in many adventures, and right now even I don't know how I'm going to end up. But in October or November I'll publish a new book called The Black Cat of Love. They're love poems, narrative, which are a response to my divorce, and in which a very important biographical route appears. They're poems which were written in London, if I'm not wrong, in July 2005. Later they continued in Toronto and New York in July 2006, and they were finished in Victoria in December 2006. They talk about a loss of love, about a marriage breakup, and for that reason I later included another set of references, like the solid marriage of a lost generation, like that of our parents, with two emblematic poems like My Father and My Mother. And then later on, so that it wouldn't be so biographical, I wrote a tale about cats, so that the reader would be able to think that I'm not only talking about me, and in that cat's tale the symbol appears, the tenderness appears, which in the end makes it not a graphic novel, but a love story from start to finish.
And there you're bringing up a very important subject, which sometimes hasn't been overcome in the critique of poetry, in the way of receiving poetry, at least in the Spanish language, which is, where does the poetry of confession stop and where does the poetry of fantasy or fiction begin? I mean, the reader in Spanish, apart from the cases of translations, isn't very used to confronting poems which aren't real or which he thinks aren't real.
Because they confuse, generally, poetry with biography. But no, fiction is the weapon of literature, and it can be as valid for the novel as it can for poetry. Many of the poems in which I appear with a very important capital I haven't happened to me. Many times, not only was it not me, but very often I would put myself inside the body of a woman and give a voice to the erotic feelings, the desire of a woman. And I think that many times that's a job which the poet and the writer should balance very well. But when it comes down to it, the reader can get confused and can be reading a story catalogued as biography or true story when it doesn't contain any truth at all.
And the poetry then turns into a vaudeville show, full of twists and misunderstandings, which you have to start unravelling.
That's why it's very important for me to separate the figure of the poet from that of a man or a woman. A man isn't a poet 24 hours a day. He's a man, he's a friend, he's a father, a worker, or if it's a woman, with her things. Inevitably, later he has moments of clarity or of work or of poetic trance which lead him to value writing.
What use is writing to you? After more than 20 years publishing nearly all of your life writing, what use is it to you? Why do you write?
To find my place in the world. And now I'm going to say something which 10 years ago I wouldn't have been able to say, to try and be a little bit happier, or at least in order to know myself a bit better. When I talk about finding my place in the world, it's to portray the world, to criticize it too, and also change it, redraw it, draw it with words, mould it, and above all to enter into a dialogue with the readers. Because the readers don't have those words. They don't have that explanation. They have life, but they don't have those words. And when you put those words in front of the reader, he can identify with them. And precisely, they serve also as knowledge and balm for him.
There's a great aphorism in Poetry and You which you stress, which is something like, the poet writes so that the reader realises what happens to others, and in some way it works like a street lamp. Once again, we go back to that.
As light, as guidance. Also, because of this, the poet and the writer must have a weight of responsibility which is not often valued.
Well, we're getting to an important subject, which is responsibility as human beings, and that includes being a poet. Which of your poems would you choose from all of the maybe, not thousands, but over 1,000 that you've got?
I don't have a favourite poem. There are times when I reread some books, and there are poems which really surprise me. There are poems which I like more because I know why I wrote them, what I was wearing and who they were aimed at, or what it was I wanted to do. But it is true that the readers recognise some poems which have become favourites. I remember, for example, in I Always Counted to 10, there's the poem which is the title of the book. In Digging the Earth with Your Dreams, there's a poem which they always ask me for, which is Existing. And it's very difficult for me to read because it still hurts. In A Place for Us, there's Where to Tell You. They're very often the key poems which light or guide the complete reading of the book. In Single Poetry, Pure Premonition, I remember The Wait. The Wait is a very beautiful poem, which it also explains the origin of the book, how the book happens, with those white notebooks, etc. But, as I said before, I don't have a favourite poem because I think that the best is yet to come. The best is yet to be written. The best poem hasn't been written yet, because I'm someone who thinks that the future of literature should also be accompanied by an unbeatable future, not only for society, but for the writer himself. The conditions of the writer in the 20th or 21st centuries have nothing to do with conditions in earlier times. I'm not saying that we're cleverer, but we do have more opportunities to develop a piece of work.
Nowadays, with the internet, you can say that if we walk 20 paces, we can find a book of drawings by Antonio Lopez, something which would be very difficult to imagine 150 years ago, when the resources we have today didn't exist. And that also means we have to be aware. If I were to say to you the word, but you've said that the best is yet to come, but in your poetry, for example, in Hands Up or even in Poetry and You, the word defeat is repeated a lot. There's a series in Poetry and You where the word defeat appears time and again in almost all the aphorisms. Is life a defeat? Or when you write, is that how you see it?
Life is a continual learning process. And there are ways of approaching life like more contemplative or more reflective, but in writing it is a defeat because writing summons failure.
Failure of communication for a start.
Yes, and above all, I believe that very often we think that each book had a different soul at the beginning, and a series of question marks which continue to be present as doubts which later carry on in different books. But one lives in failure, in isolation, in indifference. That, on the other hand, is a good thing, and the successes in poetry and in writing, I don't know what they would be for my colleagues, but for me it's simply to live from writing, to be able to live from writing, and to do it. Everything else is a question of the day-to-day, which leads men or women to focus their own lives in one way or another. But when you live in writing, the feeling of failure is much stronger than that of joy or success. However, there are also very happy moments, because nowadays...
When you finally finish a poem, I suppose.
Yes, and there are also happy moments, because nowadays, for example, in my case, I'm much happier writing than before. Before, I found it more difficult. I was harder on myself, more of a perfectionist, and I didn't know how to forgive myself. Now I live in a more idealist way of seeing things, and for that reason I also play down the importance of failure. But failure is there. Moreover, it's a light, not a bitter one, but it's an important light to show us that mistakes can be overcome, and that errors are not really such things, and that one shouldn't mess around other than to respond to the very questions of writing.
It's like saying that it's nothing, isn't it? Writing.
Diminish the importance of things. The It's Nothing was a way of playing down problems of love, but it was also a way of playing down perfection, the importance that we give ourselves, and also the job of writing.
I suppose it's a good lesson for life on all levels. I mean, it works for writing and also for a bank manager to bring a distance to things.
In fact, I think that one of the most important philosophical changes isn't guided by great ideas, but simply by having your feet on the ground. A little bit of common sense, and in the end playing down achievements as much as failures.
How does one manage? There's another word which appears a lot in the first books, in I Always Counted to 10 and You Never Appeared, which is the metaphor perhaps of defeat, and which I also associate with Faber, which is rust.
Yes, it's the passing of time, the ruin. I talked earlier about self-portraits in order to prop up time. I've also spoken about the difference between the short book and the long one, the long book summoning a solidity of time. I've also talked about Faber, about Ticino, about Flisch, as a metaphor for time and the human condition. And I think that ruin or rust is a metaphor for those poems.
Or grime, which appears in some...
Yes, those poems, they're words which I like, moreover. They're words like from the north with those strong R's, so resonant. And it drew my attention because as one walks around or goes for a stroll, the landscape speaks to him.
Yes, I suppose the sea has a lot of that.
The sea too, the rocks, but cities also speak. And in the face of modern buildings which rise up to improbable heights, one can find a corner, some rust, a ruin, which speaks to him a little of the fragility of the human being and the passing of time.
You have two spaces in your life. One is the village where you were born, and the other the town of Vitoria where you live. When you write, do you notice changes if you're in one place or the other? How has one place or the other influenced you?
No. Space and writing is writing. The thing is that urban spaces and seascapes are, let's say, are like snapshots which you have in your mind. But space is writing. I like going back to the sea, and in August every year I reread Pavis as a homage to the light, the coincidence of his suicide. But the sea has an important mode of internal reflection, and then it has a sound. And the city has another noise and another sound, and that of the birds as well. But all that one carries in his internal landscape, in the internal voice. When writing, it doesn't interfere, because you are inside the writing.
You did well, along with Mincho, a beautiful book, in my opinion. I Was Born in Vitoria, about the town of Vitoria, Poems of the Walker is its title, with some beautiful paintings by Mincho. What did you see? The Walker. What is it for you, the Walker?
It's a metaphor beyond a town like Vitoria, although it is also a homage to the town where I live. It refers to a town which takes in the immigrant. That's the dilemma between the passerby and the walker. The passerby would be the man from the town, and the walker is the man of the road who arrives in the town. It's that symbiosis between tradition and modernity, between the native and the immigrant, and above all, it's a book written to be understood by a 10-year-old child and a gentleman older than 80. With poems which are apparently simple and very heartfelt, which speak a bit about the significance of creating a town among all of us, which in the end is also an added metaphor of what poetry is.
A space of reconciliation among everyone.
Yes, among everyone, all the poets, all the readers, each with a vision, each with a way of understanding the world, but valid for everyone.
If you agree, and today, seeing as I have the chance, I'd like, as one of your long-time readers, along the lines of the titles of your poetic works, you to tell me, as if this was a free jazz concert, the first solo you think of, in whatever key you want and whatever tempo you prefer.
And whatever length.
And whatever length you want.
Okay.
I always counted to 10 and you never appeared.
I was on the point of changing the title at the last minute. It's a good job I didn't. This is the book which opened me up to an audience. From the periphery, it opened me up to an important audience. It's a book which is now in its 5th edition. It's been translated into other languages, and it's the book which people often ask me to recite. I think it's the book which gave me considerable strength and made me trust in what I was writing. Because although it was published almost in the year 2000, it was a book which I'd been maturing, despite its shortness, for a few years before. The truth is, I'm very grateful to Calembour for publishing this book, and above all for the results it achieved. I remember that there weren't many reviews, and the most important media of the time hardly mentioned it. But an important drip started, and the readers seized on it. And it allowed me, overnight, to make a name for myself in the field of the arts and poetry.
5 editions in poetry.
Yes, and also translation into other languages, which opened doors for me in other countries, which is always important.
Digging the earth with your dreams.
This is an intimate book. I like the title because it talks about that. It talks about unreality, and the poet sees himself as a farmer who digs the earth. There's an erotic part, also important. There's dating society with violence, because there are some landscapes which refer to what is happening and used to happen more so, if that's possible, in the Basque Country. There are some poems which are still difficult for me to read in public.
A place for us.
Before a place for us, I'd like to talk about cardio slogans, because I always counted to 10 and you never appeared, Digging the Earth with Your Dreams, and cardio slogans form part of a trilogy. With cardio slogans, the critics said, with this book, Kepa Murua reached maturity, and I laughed because it was the first one I wrote of that trilogy. The truth is, they were published indistinctly. They were published in reverse order, but cardio slogans was a book which I wrote when I was young. Only I guessed that at that time the public and also the publishing world weren't ready to accept a book of those characteristics. And in fact, I still think it's a book which will be discovered in the future. It was written in a trance, a poetic trance, while I was living in Freiburg. When I was crossing the bridge, the name came to me. The title, Cardio Slogans, came to me. But I know why it did. Because before I went to Germany, I tore up, because of my publishing failures, I tore up many poems and thought about giving it all up. And when I thought about abandoning poetry, or thought that poetry had abandoned me, in Freiburg I began in a restless way to write a poem every day. I remember how the first title came to me, Cardio Slogans. Then I remember Delay. Some very interesting poems. When I read it, the truth is that they also make my hair stand on end.
A year after Cardio Slogans, Poetry and You comes out.
Yes, poetry and you are some very refined aphorisms in which I talk about death, a subject which at that time and still today is difficult to work from the field of literature or thought. And it talks a bit about love, about defeat, about violence, and about the first babblings about why I write.
And about God.
Also about God, a subject which has interested me. Religion interests me as a man, as a citizen, and I often wonder. And in those aphorisms there's a formal refinement, but its publication was also risky because at that time young poets didn't publish, or they didn't have the opportunity to publish books about thoughts about aphorism. Nowadays it's much more frequent, but with Poetry and You I think I opened a door to that type of genre, above all to see that the poet or poetry is accompanied by a kind of literature, which many times is defined as inferior and that for me is all the same.
Hands Up.
Hands Up has very tender poems. Some are very narrative and long. Let's say there I'm looking for a kind of poetic justice. When I wrote it, the world was devastating, just like now. With wars, there was the problem of the old Yugoslavia, and the truth is that the pictures in the media were dramatic. Then, from the solitude of the poet, one becomes an expressive figure and starts opening up to his hands, which in a way symbolise that contrast. Hands up when you're going to be mugged or shot, and on the contrary, those hand gestures, from thumping a table to shaking someone's hand or hugging them or caressing them. There starts to be a stroke of tenderness which is inevitable in my books, because one of my female readers, who had also followed me for a long time, said to me once, "Kepa Murua, I really like your books, but sometimes they lack certain tenderness." I thought, what rubbish she's just said. But later I went back and thought it over and said, maybe she's right. I think that at that time I was in need of tenderness and I went looking for it through words.
A beautiful book. Blue Songs of the Dark God.
A devastating book. A different book. A devastating book. It reminds me of my son Jürgen. With this book, I think a lot about my son, a lot, because I thought, how am I going to explain this book to my son one day? And look how time has passed, and I think I have explained it to him, although I don't know if he's taken any notice of me. And then there's, of course, A Place for Us, another devastating book. But that one helped me to explain the violence in the Basque Country. With that book, a strange thing happened to me. People who had always said hello to me stopped doing it, and people who had never said hello to me before started doing it. And I went, you've done something different. You've done something very strange, and I know why. Because I wanted to explain the problem of terrorism. Although I was talking about the Basque Country, it could transcend to any part of the world. Because it's a book which can be understood by a reader in New York, a reader in Madrid or in San Sebastian. And there are some narrative poems appear. Because to explain myself, to explain that fact of terrorist violence or domestic violence, I needed a more narrative poetry. And there I started to tell things, there I let loose. In there as well also appear the self-portraits. There are love poems, but also a lot of coldness. It was a difficult book, a very hard book of poems, and I remember it sold out in 3 months.
And it was re-edited.
Yes, and it's still being re-edited.
And after those titles, some of them so long, It's Nothing.
It's Nothing is a more tender book of poems, where I give voice to the dead. I also give voice to those who don't have words. And I speak a bit about love and loss of love. The landscape of It's Nothing is the sea, the blue sea. The colour of It's Nothing is blue. And I also really like the title, because it's a way of looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, it's nothing, Kepa Murua, carry on. The mistakes we make, the misunderstandings we cause, and we forgive ourselves, or we laugh and say, another new opportunity. For love, for life, for work, for everything.
and the thick volume of single poetry, Pure Premonition.
It's 20 years of writing. The first poem I wrote when I was living in Berlin in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and the last I think I wrote in 2009. The correction process was also very hard. I would get up every day almost at 4 o'clock in the morning to be able to correct them because there are more than 700 poems. There were 13 or 14 notebooks, and later they were reduced, but the poetic work is wonderful. It's like a symphony. There, I think at the beginning I suffered for what I'd written, but once I was able to organise the book and start working on it, then I had a good time. I enjoyed the craftsmanship of writing. I like that book a lot. There are black places and passages, but also in moments of extreme clarity and a lot of light.
And the Black Cat of Love.
I talked about the Black Cat earlier. There's a poem which I like a lot called My Tiny Heart. My Tiny Heart because I, at that time, in the midst of losing love, felt incapable of writing love poems. And then life showed me just the opposite. But well, I'm happy. Just as in that moment I was suffering because of what I was writing, now when I've corrected it, I've laughed quite a lot. I've laughed a lot. It's also about that. Many times poetry should be like balm, not only for the reader, but also for the writer himself.
Well, thank you for writing so well, and for writing so much.
Thank you to you, Pedro.